Okay. And next, I'm going to mute everybody for just a little bit. So let me do that. Okay, now I've muted everybody, so I can't hear you and no one else online can hear you. But when the time comes that you want to talk, all you have to do is unmute yourself and we'll continue on. All right, this is our next session. I believe this is session number 3. Is it 3 or 2? 3, it's 3. All right, I can't believe it. We're only 5 sessions. This is session number 3. For those of you who weren't with us last week, we talked about the battles, the wars of King Saul. And in a very cursory way, we covered the 20-year reign of King Saul very, very quickly. And we didn't talk about a lot of battles. We really concentrated on one major conflict, one major battle, which became paradigmatic, became symbolic of the other battles that Saul fought. We learned some things about King Saul last week, which I just want to mention again for those of you who are with us and those of you who are not with us. Number one, King Saul reigned for a period of about 20 years. His reign occurred sometime around 1220 BCE to about 1200 BCE. Could be off a couple decades, but he reigns for 20 years. He is the first king of Israel. He was noted because of his unusual size and charisma. Saul was a tall man. He stood out among the crowd. He was from a rather small, undistinguished tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. But in terms of his appearance, his characteristics, his overall demeanor, he looked very much the role of the king. So when Samuel anointed Saul as king at God's behest, and he introduces Saul to the people, the initial, oh, hold on, just one moment, please. Okay, I'm going to close that off. Yes, it is. Okay, thank you. Okay, so when we are introduced to Saul, we see a man who is unpresupposing. He's not a braggart. He's a rather modest man. When he first is announced as king, remember, he is hiding among the baggage. He doesn't even promote himself. He's rather self-effacing. He steps back, and he seems like the kind of a man who would make a good king. We learn that Saul is resolute. When men of a town across the Jordan River called Yavesh Gilad were under attack, they send word. Saul summons the tribes of Israel to a forced march and a surprise attack. Saul wins this decisive battle. And then in the aftermath of that battle, he is coronated a second time, and all Israel accepts Saul as being their king. Now, Saul fought a number of battles, and over the course of time, characteristics of Saul came out, which were not so attractive. First of all, Saul was rather impetuous. He took it upon himself to do things, to perform actions, even though God had either not commanded him to do so or he had been told not to do it, and he goes ahead and he does it anyway. So one of the things you have to know about Saul is that unlike some Jewish figures, he doesn't follow God's commands to the T. He sometimes takes it upon himself to act under his own initiative, and he makes decisions, and sometimes there are negative consequences for his rashness. The other thing you will discover about Saul is he appears to be a strong man, but he is much too influenced by his public image. He is much too influenced by what his followers, his people think about him. You'll see that today. A true king, a king of Israel who was appointed by God and understood that he held a special position, would not be as sensitive and not be as deferential to public opinion as Saul was. And you'll see tonight that what causes Saul losing his kingdom was the fact that he didn't value his own power. He defers to the people and he doesn't defer to God, and this causes him to make a tremendously terrible mistake, as we will see. The third thing you will see about Saul, you'll see it starting next week, is he's paranoid. Saul is paranoid. At a certain point in his life, especially after God announces through the prophet Samuel that Saul will no longer be king of Israel, Saul sees enemies on every side. he suddenly sees intrigue and plotting everywhere. He is a paranoid king, much as later on in Jewish history, King Herod was a paranoid king. Saul, once he realizes that his power, his grip on power is being slowly relaxed, that it's escaping him, he will see everybody as an adversary, and he will go to great lengths to wipe out anybody who he sees as dangerous to his house and to his throne. So we're going to take a look at Saul today, but in order to do this, we have to look at one more battle. And before we go into this one more battle, I want to talk with you briefly about the concept of war, okay? Because in order to understand today's portion, you have to understand something about the Jewish view of war. By the way, all civilizations and all religions really have their views of war. Islam has its concept of the Holy War. So by the way, to Christianity, that was the Crusades. All religions have their concept of what is called the just war, the war that God approves. In many religious societies, war, which people resort to for a variety of reasons, is sometimes justified by the religion. And that's one of the issues we're going to have to deal with tonight. So let me begin with a prior question, and I'm going to ask you to respond. I will raise the question, what is war? And then I'm going to ask you a question. So what is war? Basically, what is war? War is typically a conflict or a confrontation of one group of people against another group of people with the aim of achieving a particular objective through force, okay? One group of people competes with another group of people with a certain objective which they can seem only to gain through force. To put it shortly, war is a way of settling a dispute among people that they are unable to resolve peacefully. If I want something, if I engage in conflict with another group of people, I'm trying to obtain an objective. If I can't do it peacefully, if I resort to force to gain my objectives, that is what we call war. So that's what I think is a pretty basic definition we can all go by. A question that I'm going to ask you now is, historically, wars have always been fought. Wars exist in the earliest civilizations, and they're fought for a lot of different reasons. I made a list of the common reasons that war is fought. So just so that we can start with a little discussion, I'm going to give you all a chance to suggest some of the reasons that people go to war. Anybody want to suggest a reason? What are the causes of war? Marlene and then Leslie.
Land. They want the land.
Land. All right. We would call that territorial gain. People go to war because they want territory. It can be crops, fields, land, breathing room, boundaries, secure boundaries, whatever it is. People go to war for territories. And when I say people, I don't just mean nations. Native American tribes in America before the coming of the Europeans, they often fought one another for territory, for lands that were rich in animals or fields or whatever it was. War was fought for territorial gain. Good. Okay, that's one. Anybody else want? Oh, Leslie, you had it one.
Well, I was going to say the same thing, but for freedom.
Okay, for freedom. War is sometimes fought as a means of social protest. When we think of that, we think of things like the Revolutionary War, which was fought when it was perceived that Britain was taking away certain rights that colonists had, and so the colonists went to war to establish freedom for themselves. Very good. Someone else, go ahead, Neil.
Would you differentiate resources versus land or territory?
Yeah, I would call resources economic gain. Okay, land is one kind of, territorial gain is one kind of war. But sometimes people don't go to war for territorial purposes. They go for what are called economic gain, to acquire women, to acquire lands, to acquire property. A lot of wars are raids where one party tries to raid another party and acquire economic advantage. So let's call that economic gain. So territorial gain, economic gain, okay, gain, freedom, which is an ideological, by the way, Leslie, is an ideological reason to go to war. If someone says, I'm going to war because I am not free, and I believe that I should be free, and I'm going to revolt to get my freedom, that's an ideological, we would call that an ideological reason for war, okay? Go ahead, Joseph, and then Esther.
Perhaps one country goes to war with another in the guise of increasing the security of their nation to put down a perceived enemy or a perceived army around them, or to gain, river buttress, or to add security.
Good. Where one fears that an enemy is taking advantage or gaining an advantage over one can go to what is called a preemptive war, which means that even though you have not been attacked, if you see a serious security threat developing, you may go to war to preempt that threat. When the Russians went into the Ukraine, what were they afraid of? They were afraid that Western influences were approaching very close to the border of Russia. And they were afraid that the Ukraine was going to eventually join NATO and missiles were going to be on Russia's frontiers. And therefore, Russia, under the pretext of denazification, which was just a lie, they went into the Ukraine for the purpose of preventing the Ukraine from being a strategic opponent in case of a future war. Very good, Joseph. Anybody else? Go ahead. Let's see, Esther?
Religious wars.
Yes, religion has always been a factor in war. People have gone to war over religions, and all of the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have all fought what would be called religious wars. Thank you, Esther. Erwin, you had your hand up.
It is interesting to know that the majority of wars that have been fought through the history were between adjacent groups. Very seldom do you see a war between, like the United States and Vietnam, but in general, they're between neighbors.
Originally, that was the case. Erwin is correct, because originally battles were fought with the people who were closest to you. When you were small tribes, you fought against other tribes. When you were in border areas, you fought across the people whose land was close to your border. But as time goes on and as nation states develop, wars become more global in their impact. So as Erwin states, at a certain point, wars are not fought just between neighbors. Wars can be fought across large geographic boundaries. You can have world wars. So that is true. That is a distinction of different kind of a war, a local conflict versus a national or an international conflict. Okay. Anybody else? Neil, go ahead.
You addressed the idea of fighting for freedom, but there are wars that with the intent of oppression.
All right, but usually oppression has a purpose. Yes, wars of oppression are wars that are fought for a specific purpose, but usually people who fight those wars don't say, I'm fighting this war to oppress other people. Even people who are out to establish empires defend their right to an empire with other ways. Very few times do people say, I'm going to conquer people just so I can oppress them, even though that's the natural result of what happens sometimes. Anybody else? I'll give a couple more moments. Erwin, go ahead.
I'm not sure all the categories that we discussed so far included revolutions.
Okay, we discussed economic gain, territorial gain, religion, ideology.
I guess ideology would be revolution.
Revolution is
General revolutions.
Yeah, ideology. You could argue that the Civil War was a war fought for ideology and economic and geographic reasons, okay? By the way, very rarely is there only one factor. Usually there's a mixture of factors involved in wars. But when the South of the United States saw that it was losing influence and that slavery was beginning to disappear, they fought a war for ideology, for economics, because the economy of the South depended upon slaves, and for another area we haven't covered. War is fought for political advantage, okay? People fight wars for politics, okay? Two people want to be the king. You can't all be kings, so you fight, or, armies fight for political advantage. The one who becomes the victor, they have the leadership of the country. That's political advantage. I'm just going to suggest a couple more. Wars are fought sometimes for revenge. This is the oldest kind of war, okay? You do something, your tribe comes and does something to my tribe's honor has been sullied. You have cast an aspersion upon my tribe, so we're going to come after your tribe. And the motivation for that, whether we gain anything out of it, we just want revenge. We want to take revenge on you, okay? And finally, no one has said this, wars can be fought for self-defense. Some people fight wars not to gain anything. They fight wars because they find themselves in a situation where they're suddenly faced with attack, and the only way they can protect themselves is by defending themselves. And by the way, not all wars of self-defense are wars where the aggressor strikes first. In 1967, when the Egyptians and the surrounding Arab armies caught Israel in a kind of a pincer movement, and they shut the Suez Canal and began to threaten to drive the Jews into the sea, it wasn't the Arab armies that started the Six-Day War. Israel struck a preemptive attack because it knew what was happening, and to defend itself against what it knew was coming, created a preemptive attack, and was successful in winning in 6 days a very important war. All right, very good. You all get an A. Those are all reasons to fight wars. So you can see that there is rarely one single cause, clear cause for conflict and ultimately war. The causes of war are usually numerous, and they are often intertwined in very complicated ways. And usually when you look at conflicts, you see several different factors coming together. Now, before I turn to King Saul and the war we're going to talk about, I want to talk about something else. There are different ways of categorizing. Well, we've talked about some of the reasons for which people go to war, but there are ways in which people compare wars. I'm going to give you 3 categories, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think it means? There are what are called offensive wars and defensive wars. Can someone tell me the distinction between a war of offense and a war of defense? Someone want to tell me that? Offensive or defensive wars? Okay. Huh? Okay. But just like in football, offense, defense, right? When the offense is playing, they are the ones who are initiating the action. They are the ones who are driving the play. They are trying to achieve a goal. In the case of football, the goal is to score a touchdown. The people who are trying to prevent the team from scoring, that's called the defense, okay? So the distinction in war between an offensive war and a defensive war is who is the party that initiates the war and what the purpose is for the initiating the war. If you initiate the war and your purpose is to secure one of the objectives we talked about just a few moments ago, you are probably engaged in what is called an offensive war. If you are protecting yourself and your country and your countrymen from that attack, you are fighting a defensive war. Michael, you were going to say something.
Yeah, isn't that just the same war? I mean, it's one war, 2 sides.
Right, but it's one war, but it's two different ways. If I were to ask you in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which country was fighting the offensive war, Michael, you would tell me what?
Well, usually Russia, occasionally.
Yes, all right.
Ukraine.
And you would say that Ukraine didn't initiate the war. Ukraine was involved in defending its territorial integrity and keeping it from being overrun.
Right, but I would say there's one war, not 2 wars. There's not an offensive war and a defensive war. There's just one war.
All these involve one war, just 2 ways to describe. You're right, it's one war. Okay, so you could describe war as either offensive or defensive. Now I'm going to give you another characterization, just and unjust wars. Someone want to tell me the distinction, and sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder, but what is the distinction between a just war and an unjust war? Someone want to explain that to me? Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, it would be just if you're trying to defend yourself.
All right, conceivably, if you're just trying to defend yourself, you're not the aggressor, you would think you were fighting the just war. Although there are some people who think that societies can act so unjustly that it's legitimate to attack that society in order to protect individuals. For example, let's say a country like Uganda was killing its citizens wholesale or killing minorities within its government. and outside forces, coalitions or individuals come in to try and prevent the slaughter, theoretically, the outside force is the aggressor, is the one that's fighting the offensive war, Leslie, but they are fighting it to stop the oppression that's going on inside the country. So there you could have a war that is both offensive, but also you can define it as a just war. What's the difference between a just war and an unjust war? And by the way, theologians have asked this question a long time. Go ahead, Joseph.
Sometimes it takes, looking backwards, but I would say, if most agree that it's ethical, that you have an ethical reason or a moral reason, then that's a just war. And if most people agree that it was unmoral to wage and kill over this cause, then it's unjust.
Very good. It has to do with both your reason for initiating or being involved in the war, and it has to do with the means by which you fight the war. It's not only a matter of your motive, it's a matter of the strategy or the way in which the war is fought. If you are fighting a war for moral purposes, for values, for the sake of preserving life, and you are fighting it in a way that is moral and that tries to follow what are called rules of war, whatever that means, that would be considered a just war. Okay? Certainly, if you're attacked and you're defending yourself, that's a just war. An unjust war is a war that is fought not because of any valid reason, it's being fought for a selfish reason, okay? So just and unjust. Okay, one last category and then we get to the meat of tonight. A hot war versus a cold war, okay? These are all terms that are important. What is the difference between what is called a hot war and a cold war? And it's not a war that's fought in the summer as opposed to the winter. Okay, Michael, again, go ahead.
So a hot war, there's actual one side is attacking the other, or both sides are physically attacking. There's some kind of physical attack. Cold wars, propaganda, moving troops around, things like that.
Yeah. It is sometimes the case that in a Cold War, you can have actual battles. Battles can occur in a Cold War too. But usually the distinction between a hot war and a cold war is the degree of violence, the actual degree of combat that occurs in the war itself. If it is a war that involves large numbers of people and continual strikes back and forth against each other involving serious weaponry, that's typically called a hot war. If it is a war that is being fought not so much on the battlefield, but diplomatically through diplomats and through sanctions and other means, that is usually called a cold war. Now, both can have disastrous consequences. Usually, there are far more casualties initially in a hot war than there is in a cold war. But even that is not always the case. So, hot war and cold war. All right. Now, it seems that we have covered everything, except the one thing that you have to know, which is Judaism's view of war, because Judaism takes in all the things we just talked about, except it adds one other distinction, one other category that we haven't discussed yet. And that is the difference. This goes all the way back to biblical times, the difference between a obligatory war and a discretionary war. Let me see if I can explain that to you. An obligatory war is a war which must be fought. You are obligated to fight it. A discretionary war is a war that you may fight. It may be a valid war, but you are not obligated to pursue it. Even if the causes for which you are striving are good causes, you have the right to say it's not worth going to war for. In other words, it's discretionary, it's permissible. If I want to do it, I can do it, but I'm not obligated to do it. Judaism, in addition to the distinctions we just made, defines all war as being either obligatory war or discretionary war. Okay, and they even have Hebrew terms for it. The word for obligatory war in Hebrew is milchemet mitzvah, a war that is fought at God's command, or milchemet chova, which is pretty much the same, a war which is obligatory because the objectives for which you are fighting, you are obligated to seek because of God, whether God explicitly commanded it or not. If it is obligatory in terms of the divine system, you have to fight that kind of a war. All the other kinds of wars that are fought in the world are discretionary wars. And I can tell you that today, all wars that Israel faces, except one kind of war, are all discretionary wars. Okay. So what are the categories? What are the examples? There are 3 wars that are obligatory according to the Hebrew Bible. One of them, 2 of them actually you already have had a familiarity with. Actually, all 3 you may have. The first war is the war against the 7 Canaanite nations. For those of you who studied with me in the book of Exodus and then in the book of Joshua and Judges, you know that in the Torah, God tells Moses and the Jewish people that when they cross the Jordan River and they enter into the land that God is giving them, the land of their ancestors, that they are to fight an obligatory war against the 7 nations that make up the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Obligatory war, and this is a mitzvah war. God commands that it be fought. A second category of that second example of that same category is the wars against Amalek, which we're going to discuss tonight. Amalek was an ancient enemy of the Jewish people. We'll take a look at it tonight. And just like the 7 Canaanite nations, God imposes an oath upon the Jewish people that when there is an opportunity, when the time comes, that they are to fight a war with no concessions, with no arbitration, with no surrender against Amalek. That is the second war. There is only one other kind of war that is considered to be an obligatory war, and that is a war of self-defense. If Israel is attacked by outside enemies that seek to destroy the country, their people, their way of life, then war is obligatory. You must fight it. Now, what do I mean obligatory? Every able man must fight. If you are 20 years of over and one of those 3 wars apply, there is no exemptions. There are no draft status. You fight, okay? Against the 7 Canaanite nations, against Amalek, and the war of self-defense, every man fights. And in Israel, at a certain period in modern history, every man and able-bodied woman fought. And it's today in the Israeli army, women also serve in the Israel Defense Forces. These 3 kinds of war are obligatory. Okay, you must do battle in them. Any other kind of a war may be fought. It is permissible to fight, but even those wars can only be declared with the approval of the king, okay, or the religious equivalent to the king, the high court, the Sanhedrin, the great court. There is no more king anymore in Israel today. There is no more Sanhedrin. So the only war that can still be fought that doesn't require the king or the Sanhedrin is a war of self-defense. If Israel is under general attack, then the civil authorities can issue a call for general mobilization, and every able-bodied person will fight in that war. Any other kind of war is what we would call discretionary. The government can fight the war, but the difference is the laws of obligatory wars are different than the laws of discretionary wars. Now, let me say one last thing. Wars have rules. You may have heard the saying, all is fair in love and war. But as those of you who study with me continuing on, especially we get to the book of Deuteronomy, there are such things as rules of war. Jews have to follow certain rules when it comes to warfare, laying siege, offering terms of surrender. There are all kinds of rules that you must follow. It's not anything goes. It's not you can do anything in a time of war. It's not all is fair in love and war. War has its rules. You must abide by the rules. Okay, that is clear. So the nature of the rules differs whether you are fighting a obligatory war, milchemet mitzvah, or whether you are fighting a war that is discretionary, a milchemet reshut. And with that, we begin our portion today. In the book of Samuel, chapter 15, Samuel comes to King Saul and he says to Saul, Samuel, God has sent to you, Samuel, to deliver the following message. In other words, I who appointed you am now giving you God's words. Long ago, I told the Jewish people to keep in mind what the Amalekites did to them in the beginning of their history. And I told the Israelite people while they were still in the wilderness in the early part of their journey, that when the time came and I authorized a war against the Amalekites, that Israel would fight this war to the end. Samuel comes to Saul and he says, God has said the time has come. You must now settle affairs with the Amalekites. Okay, this is the time. And this is what you have in chapter 15 of the book of Samuel. Now, maybe we can do this without going back. If you know the reasons why, I don't have to go back through sources. We can do a short circuit here. Why is Israel required to fight this war to the death with Amalek, with the Amalekites? Does anybody remember? If not, I'll take you through a brief screen chart of why. I'll take it back to this. Gail, go ahead.
Did the Amalekites not, if I remember correctly, attack the Jewish people when after we had left Egypt?
Yes. The Amalekites were the first nation after the Jews had left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. They were the first nation to attack the Israelites, and they didn't even attack the main body of the Israelite forces. They attacked the rear where the weak and the old were. They hit them in the rear in a vulnerable position. They struck at the weakest of the people. Anybody else? And good, Gail. Okay, let me just put it up for a second. I'll go through it very quickly, I promise you. Okay, here. I'm going to just show you two passages. Here's Exodus. I'm just going to do it very quickly. What do I have to do when I say share? Okay, does everybody see this? Or not yet? I didn't probably hit share the screen.
Yeah, you did.
Did I? Okay. You see it yet? Okay, you see it. All right. I'm just going to read. For some reason, they've scrolled me back to Exodus. Where do they move me to? 15. I don't know why they did that. Let me get to where I have to get to. I thought they keep me where I was. Okay, sorry, everybody. 17. All right. Okay, hold on. I'll be right there. Yeah, here we go. 17, verse 8. I'm reading. The Amalekites came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some troops for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand with the rod of God in it, Israel prevailed, but whenever Moses let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hand grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus, his hands remained steady until the sun set. And Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. There's the verse, okay? Israel is victorious, and God says after the battle, inscribe this in a book. It will be a memory forever that in the future, I will utterly blot out the name of Amalek. How do I get from this back to Deuteronomy? Okay, now let me show you Deuteronomy, the other text. Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right. Can everybody see this text? See, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17. God says to Moses and the Jewish people, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. And with that, we stop. All right. So those are the texts. Okay, those are the texts. Amalek is singled out for special mention. Without spending a long time, Amalek was a unique enemy among the Jewish people. It has remained the symbol for all enemies of the Jewish. When we say Amalek, we refer to all those people in all ages and all generations who hate Jews and would seek to destroy them and wipe out Judaism if they could. God has said with those kind of people, there is no compromise. There is no middle ground. You must deal with them and you must summarily take care of them, okay? Now we come, I think I left my book in my other room. Could you bring me the books? My Samuel books. We now come to the section of chapter 15, okay? So those of you who have the book of Samuel with you, you can refer to chapter 15, and you will now see how God tells the prophet Samuel, the time has come, go to Saul and tell him the war that I have long spoken of with Amalek, that war is now ready to take place. And I'm just waiting for my book. Okay, thank you. All right. All right, chapter 15. The Lord said to Samuel, how long, I'm sorry, I said 15. Yeah, 15 is right. Oh, I'm on 16, that's why. Chapter 15. And Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over Israel, over his people, over Israel. Now, therefore, hearken to the voice of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he set himself against him in the way when he came up out of Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Okay? What we have here is what is called a war of total destruction, a war of cherem. No prey taken, no captives taken. This is not a war for property, not a war for material gain. This is a war to be fought on behalf of the Lord, like the wars against the 7 Canaanite nations. And to demonstrate that this war is not being fought for their own personal selfish reason, the Israelites are to leave none left. Okay, now there's a certain moral difficulty with this whole concept. I understand that, and I'm certainly willing to talk about it with you, but let's assume for the moment that God has said, all right, this is the war. You are to leave nobody, okay? No man, no woman, no child, no infant, no property of any kind. Anything that you encounter in the war is to be destroyed. Yes, go ahead, Neil.
I can't, my classes run together. I'm not sure if it was the Monday class or the Thursday class, but we were talking about God being a forgiving God. Well, he's held this grudge for how many years?
Well, let's see, by the time of King Saul, the grudge, as you put it, has been going on, let's see, has been going on for about 200 years. Okay, about 200 years between the initial attack of Amalek and God's words to Israel and this battle of King Saul. So up until this point, it's 200 years later, finally Israel is in a military position where they are able to fulfill God's instructions. So go ahead, Neil, what do you want to say?
We had characterized it as God is quick to forgive. And here's a story that is counter to that.
Yes, all right, good. In 99% of, in most cases, yes, God is willing to forgive. He's certainly willing to forgive on an individual level. But when it comes to these national wars, Neil, there is a war that God is not willing to forgive. And we just have to accept the fact that for whatever reason, if you are in a category of people covered by that war, there is no middle ground. Now, it depends on the situation. When Israel went in to fight the Canaanites had an option. They could leave the land. If they stayed, Israel had to deal with them and wipe them out. But they had the option of leaving and getting out of the land. The only war that I know of where that is not an option is this war with the Amalekites. For whatever reason, God is not forgiving. It's absolute war, and it's war to the end. If you do not win it, eventually you will lose it. You will be victim to it. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a little bit. Anybody else? Question? Leslie.
Like Neil, I have really trouble with the God that created everybody and then has the chosen people to destroy, wipe out a whole nation or whatever it is. Why God is making them do that, why he just didn't do it himself.
Well, remember that at a certain point, God acts through human beings. The whole idea of the progression of human history is that we are agents of God, and that God stops acting through miracles and he acts through the actions of nations. He acts through people who follow his law. God could have done it himself, but at a certain point, God uses nations or uses the free will of people to achieve his purpose in the world. So while God could have theoretically done it with an earthquake or whatever you want to, however you want to describe it, he chose that human beings would be the agents for his judgment, okay? He determined that in this war, human beings would execute his judgment, okay? Go ahead, Michael, and then Joseph.
So has anybody had any commentary on why it was the Israelites that had to do this? I mean, when they were, during time of Judges, when they were doing things they shouldn't have been doing, having idols and whatever, other tribes, other Canaanite groups would attack them, make their lives miserable. There were plenty of other groups there that could have whittled away the Amalekites over time. I'm assuming they were never good, they never got to recoup and be good and go down again. I'm assuming they were just all downhill. It could have been taken care of by all the other groups.
Okay. Why the Jewish people? Why Israel? Why the people of Israel, the agents of God in this fight? Well, first of all, Michael, because the fight was, as it were, brought to Israel by the Amalekites. This is a ancestral battle. This is a battle through the ages that was initiated by the Amalekites. I will tell you this. Michael is correct. The Amalekites are not the only people who have persecuted the Jews, okay? Throughout history, a lot of people have, okay? And they're not the only ancient people who persecuted the Jews. Without going into the deeper religious, symbolic meanings of the Amalekites are the antithesis of the Jews. If Jews are one side of the coin, Michael, the Amalekites are the other. They are personified as the active force in the world that seeks to prevent God's message from reaching the world. They are the force of darkness, of destruction, of wantonness, of evil, if you will, in the world. So it is God's people, the people of Israel, who are appointed by God to wipe evil off the face of the earth. Evil is personified, Michael, by the Amalekites. So if the Jews, and by the way, that means that until the last fight, Michael, we're both eternal. The Jews are eternal and the Amalekites are eternal, okay? This is a force that's no longer identified with a tribe. The Amalekites are a spiritual force in the world with which the Jewish people has always had to contend. And in answer to your question, Michael, there can, in the end of the history, be only one winner. If Amalek wins, then God and Israel lose. If Amalek is totally and finally obliterated, then God's kingdom can enter the world. So there is a zero-sum game, Michael. No peace, no treaty, no anything. I can do a whole course on why, and it's a whole interesting history. But basically, why the Amalekites? Because they represent par excellence the oppositional force to God in the world, and Israel, which represents God's champion in the world. Its destiny is to live a life to spread the word of God and to defeat, to utterly obliterate in the world all trace, all memory of Amalek. I don't know if that appeals to you or not, but that's the answer. Okay. Go ahead, Erwin, and then Joseph.
So is this a religious war or a war of revenge?
This is a religious war, okay? The Amalekites will always remain an enemy. At the particular period that Saul was given this command by Samuel, Israel was much more threatened by the Philistines. As we saw, the major power that threatened Israel was the Philistines. The Amalekites were always troublesome. But if you had asked King Saul, who's the major enemy of Israel right now? Who is Israel most afraid of? Which enemy is Israel most endangered by? Saul would have said the Philistines without question. They were the implacable foe. They were the ones who posed the greatest danger. But the answer is Amalek remains the enemy, whether or not at a particular time they are a danger or not. It's not a matter of revenge, although the reason for singling out Amalek was because of an event that occurred. It is a religious war. It is the war against Amalek and the war against the 7 Canaanite nations are the Jewish equivalent of what the Muslims would call a holy war. This is a holy war, which means you don't have an option to fight it. God has commanded you to fight it, and if you don't fight it, you're in violation of God's command. Now, I know this is very hard for some of you, okay? I'm trying to be honest here. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. I could give you all kinds of fancy reasons why it was necessary, but basically it doesn't matter. When God said to the Israelites, you don't compromise with the Canaanite nations, because if you do, you will pay a price. You will be the ones to suffer. The Israelites had to commit themselves to fight and to remove the 7 Canaanite nations. When God said to Israel, you will fight the Amalekites and you will totally blot out their memory from the world, this was a fight that if Israel didn't win, it would suffer from. Okay, that is the understanding. Anybody else before we go on? Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, when I read the verses that, God commanded them to kill every person, every man, every woman, every infant, every ass, every cattle, I didn't like it. I thought that perhaps I would classify it as amoral, which brought a conflict to me. But what we were talking about just war and unjust war. But when you mentioned that there was a reason not to have the livestock live, why you had to kill all the livestock, and you had to burn all the villages, because it wasn't a war of plunder. That a war of plunder is an unjust war. But so God insisting that all that be killed, no one could mistake this as there was a justification as an unjust war of plunder. No one in Canaan, no one, in that area, no neighbors, and perhaps more importantly, the Israelites themselves could not view this as a war of plunder or an unjust war.
All right. By guaranteeing that there was no gain in this war, what God was saying was, no one will ever accuse you of a secret or sinister motive. You will not derive any profit from this war. You will get neither slaves nor captives, nor animals, nor anything. You'll burn their city. You won't gain it all. Thereby showing that this war was not being fought for the reasons of the people themselves. It was being fought in God's name. Now, of course, your problem, Joseph, is you see God as just, and you see this kind of a war as unjust. So you're asking a question, can a war which God not only approves but commands be unjust? The answer is no, it cannot be. Okay, and yet it seems to us that this is not a war we would approve of, right? So it is a quandary, it is a problem. God is commanding it, therefore it is not only a just war, it's an obligatory war. Even if you didn't like the idea, you have to fight this war and you have to participate in it, okay? And by virtue of the fact that it is a mitzvah war, a war that is commanded by God, it is a war that is justly fought, okay? So it's it's kind of like the old Socrates paradox: is God love the good because it's good, or is it good because God loves it? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Go ahead, Gail.
2 comments, if I might.
Mm-hmm.
One is that 200 years is less than a grain of sand.
Mm-hmm.
Addressing what Neil said about 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of that is that mankind can only see what might happen tomorrow. God is seeing what either will or can happen generations and generations to come. So when he says we have to wipe out Amalek, there's a reason that we can't see.
Very good, Gail. God sees the big picture. It may sound horrible to wipe out an entire people, but what if the result of leaving that people intact is to wipe out a world? Okay. You know, we used to face this issue when we dealt with the question of, in the United States military, torture. If you know you are holding someone who knows that an atomic device or some other catastrophic device is out there and it's going to be deployed, are you allowed to do anything and everything, even torture, to get that information from him? Assume for the moment that we allow that the person knows, he does know, not a case of wrong identity. Are the normal limits of humanity when they're involved? Is it better to violate one branch of morality for the sake of preserving a world? Or in Gail's case, if God sees that the consequence of allowing Amalek to continue will be a disaster for the entire world, and God views this, we can't certainly, is God justified in saying, for the sake of the world, you must do this? And of course, that's asking you to take the position of God, and none of us can do that, all right? But that's a very good point, Gail, that we see what we see. If we set ourselves up as as judges of what is right and what is wrong, instead of God, then of course, and that's why, by the way, you're going to see that this is exactly what Saul does. Some of you may sympathize with Saul and later on, although not so much, I think. Neil, go ahead.
I have three independent thoughts. You had mentioned that Amalek is like the antithesis of Judaism. So are they not monotheistic?
They don't believe in divine morality at all. They have no sense of ethics. The only sense of ethics they have is their own aggrandizement, their own profit, their own benefit. It's not a question of whether they observe, how they observe God. Their only motivation is to achieve what they want, regardless of what they do.
So a clarifying question is, does it still exist today?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so there are people
Yeah.
that run around and identify themselves as Amalek?
Well, if you are, yeah, I mean, I don't know how you would characterize them, but if you have a person, I mean, I guess it depends. If you believe that all violence and all destructive action is a sickness, then maybe you would disagree with me. But if you believe there is evil in the world, then yeah, there is an evil in the world that seeks harm and hurt and that opposes everything that God stands for. If God stands for the unity and the brotherhood of all man, then the antithesis is that which stands against all human life. That's the antithesis.
So it's the Amalek human
Mhm.
today is really a representation of evil,
Yes.
not necessarily Bob down the street who's Amalek.
You would not recognize him. He is a type, Neil. Amalek no longer, it was personified at that time as a particular people. But nowadays, there are no Amalekites. We don't know who an Amalekite is. They don't exist anymore. Amalekite is a type, is the embodiment of all of these anti-God principles in the world. In other words, Hitler was identified in his generation as being Amalek. He did not believe in God. He did not believe in normal morality. He did not believe in human rights. He believed in power. He believed in doing whatever he wanted, and the moral rules didn't apply. Hitler was in his time identified as Amalek. By the way,
That actually leads me into what I was thinking is,
okay,
200 years from 1945, does Germany get destroyed?
Germany gets destroyed.
200 years from now because of Hitler.
Well, here's the thing. Amalek will never win, according to Jewish theology, so long as we do our part. So when Hitler decided he was going to establish what he called the 1,000-year Reich, it only lasted about 33 to 45. It lasted about 12, 13 years. Hitler could never have won because Hitler is Amalek, and God guarantees that Amalek will never win. Amalek, in this cosmic battle, Amalek is destined to fail. It doesn't mean they're not going to bring a lot of destruction and a lot of harm. I forget how many tens of millions of people were killed by Nazi Germany in the wars, Jews and non-Jews. I can tell you that Stalin was seen as a representation of Amalek. If you look at some of the great tyrants, the great killers, the great people in history who ravished and destroyed millions of people, that would be, Neil, the spirit of Amalek. It is the spirit of evil and power and conquest that is alive in the world. Israel, which represents smallness, which represents godliness, which represents the dignity of man, is the power in the world that is arrayed against Amalek. We are the force, God's force, in the battle with Amalek.
So this, I keep kind of splitting myself between concrete reality and philosophy. I mean, it's not, like I said, it is not, I'm asking you kind of as a question, 200 years from now, is Israel going to go kill Germany?
Why would it
Because of
kill
Nazi-
Germany
because-
200 years
because of
from
the
now?
Nazis. Because of the Nazis.
No, that would assume that Germany was Amalek.
An entity that was involved with being a Nazi.
Israel, Amalek was destroyed in the Second World War. It wasn't all Germans, it was just Hitler and his forces. Israel doesn't have to go back and now and take care of all the rest of Germans. We don't believe in collective guilt. We don't believe that if a nation does terrible things to us, we got to go back and get even. If that were the case, we would have got started with Egypt. We would have started back annihilating Egyptians.
So realistically now, it is really just a philosophical position.
Philosophical, except it has real implications.
I understand that, but I'm not trying to, but it's not humans versus humans at this point. It's
Well, it
philosophy
is.
versus-
It's humans with a certain philosophy versus other humans with a different philosophy. Correct.
Thanks.
Leslie?
So are you saying that God had the Jews destroy all of them, but we didn't destroy evil, and the Jews are still the ones that are chosen to destroy evil eventually?
Yes, we did not do that. We did not complete the mission, as you're going to see, maybe tonight. we failed the mission, Leslie.
We're still failing. We don't seem to be winning this.
Well, it's a battle for all time. We only fail at the end if we don't win. We are fighting the battle still. I'm telling you, we're still in the midst of the battle. That battle is still being fought right now. So it's too early to declare victory. But look what Saul does. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. Look what Saul does. So Saul is told by Samuel, God wants you to fight this battle. And Saul summons together a very large army, very large. It says here, Saul summoned the people and he numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. This was a big war. 210,000 warriors for this war, okay? He brings the people to the area, to the land of the Amalekites, where they are dwelling and where they are a source of problem. And before the battle starts, Saul says to the people round about who are not involved with Amalek, listen, get out of town, leave this area, do not associate with these people, do not get involved in this fight, because God has determined that this people is to pay the price. It says here, Saul said to the Kenites, who were people around the Amalekites, go, depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from the Amalekites. The Kenites, by the way, were Midianites who were related to Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. So the first thing Saul says is, listen, there's going to be a battle. You cannot stand on the sidelines. You get away from them. This is a war of total destruction. They leave. Okay. Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah as you rose to Shur, that is in front of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and he utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag. Agag was the king, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, even the young of the second birth, and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything else that was of no account and feeble, that they destroyed completely. All right. So Saul kind of fulfills, he comes in, he has this war, he puts all the Amalekites to the sword, he does everything except he spares the Amalekite king, Agag, and he doesn't destroy all the property, he takes some of the property, he allows his troops to take some of the property back. And does that sound like it's following God? No, it doesn't. So listen next. Then came the word of God unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me, I regret that I set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Saul fails to do what God has told him to do. And God comes to the prophet Samuel and says, I regret the fact now that I had you anoint Saul as king because he has turned away from doing that which I told him to do. Okay? And what was Samuel's reaction? It grieved Samuel. The word can be grieved or it angered Samuel. Either he was angry with Saul or he was angry and grieved that Saul had betrayed God. And he cried unto the Lord all that night. So Samuel's initial reaction when he heard that Saul had violated God's command was he was angry and he was grieved. And Samuel rose early the next morning to meet Saul in the camp. So Samuel gets up early the next day to let Saul know. And it was told to Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he is setting him up a monument and has gone about and passed on and gone to Gilgal. When Samuel comes to confront Saul, where the battle took place, he's told, oh, Saul already left here. He took what he took with him, and he went back to Gilgal, the main camp, and he set up a victory monument there, okay? And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandments of the Lord. So Saul greets Samuel and says, Blessed is your coming, Samuel. I've done what God wanted. Now, he is so emphatic, you can understand, he didn't understand what he did wrong. Saul doesn't understand what he has done wrong. As far as he's concerned, he's fulfilled God's commandments. He's wiped out the Amalekite nation, men and women, children. He has wiped out most of the property. As far as he's concerned, he says, welcome, Samuel. I did what God wanted me to do. And Samuel said, if so, then what is the sound of this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? If you did everything that God told you to do, then why am I hearing sheep and cattle? I shouldn't be hearing anything. God told you to destroy everything. Why am I hearing these animals? Okay. And then Samuel says, so Saul was caught up. Oh, well, I guess I didn't quite fulfill it. So now Saul is going to try and respond. And Saul said, they meaning the people, the warriors, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. I really fulfilled God's command. I destroyed all the oxen and the sheep, except, the ones we brought back to sacrifice to God. They're going to die anyway. We might as well sacrifice them and derive some benefit from them. So I did what I was supposed to do. Instead of killing them all on the field, I brought back good ones to offer as offerings to the Lord. Then Samuel said to Saul, stay, and I will tell you what the Lord has told me this night, meaning this past night. And Saul said to him, speak on. Okay, now Samuel's message. And Samuel said, though you are little in your own sight, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? Though you may not consider yourself to be king, though you may not recognize your glory, have you not been appointed by God to be king of the people of Israel? Has not the Lord anointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a journey, and the Lord said to you, go and utterly destroy the sinners from the Amalekites and fight against them until they are totally consumed. Wherefore then did you not hearken to the voice of the Lord? Why did you fly upon the spoil? Why did you do that which was evil in the sight of the Lord? How can you tell me you did what God wanted? You're being betrayed. The very animals you have in your presence betray you. You did not do what God told you to do. Now Saul is beginning to realize, He's still trying to justify himself. Let's see what Saul says. And Saul said to Samuel, "Yea, I have hearkened to the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, king of the Amalekites, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." He's testifying against himself. God said, destroy all the Amalekites. Saul says, I destroyed the Amalekites. I only left Agag. We'll have to ask why he did that, okay? But the people, again, he's blaming his army, but the people took the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the chief of the devoted things. They took them to sacrifice them to the Lord in Gilgal. In other words, we couldn't see wasting these sheep. We brought them to sacrifice them. They'll end up dead anyway, but we might as well offer them as sacrifices and offerings to God. And then Samuel said, famous words, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in hearkening to the word of the Lord? What does God prefer? Burnt sacrifices that you offer to him, or that you listen to his word and follow his command? Okay. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken is better than the fat of rams. God doesn't care. God, you can sacrifice and bring offerings, but if those offerings are brought in opposition to the word of God, then not only aren't they desirable, they're worse than desirable. And then he says, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness or perversity or pride is as idolatry and teraphim. In other words, if you do what you want to do, and you don't hearken to God, then all these sacrifices are like witchcraft and idolatry. So Samuel is saying, God doesn't care about the sacrifices. He gave you an order. He told you what to do, and you didn't listen, okay? Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king, okay? It's that ultimatum. Because you rejected God, because you did not follow his word, you have been rejected from being king. And Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in thy words, because I feared the people and hearkened to their voice. Now Saul is being honest. You're right. When the people complain, why should we kill all? I listened to the people. I didn't do what God said. I allowed the people to take these property and to bring them back as offerings and sacrifices. I have sinned against the Lord. Saul is forced to admit that he has done what he has done. And then he says, now therefore I pray you pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. In other words, I'm acknowledging it. I'm confessing it. I have sinned. Now you forgive me, and I'm going to go and I'm going to ask the Lord's forgiveness. Okay. In other words, I'll say I'm sorry, and I'll make everything better. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned to go away, Samuel turns his back on Saul, and he's walking away. Saul, to try and detain him, grabs Samuel's cloak, okay? As Samuel turned about to go away, Saul laid hold upon the skirt of the robe, and it tore, okay? He holds on to Samuel. Samuel walks away. The garment is torn, and Samuel turns, and Samuel said to him, the Lord has rent the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and it is given it to a neighbor of yours that is better than you. Just as the cloak has been torn, God has torn away the kingdom from you and will give it to another better than you. In other words, you can't make this good. So the glory of the Lord will not lie or repent, for he is not man that he should repent. There is nothing you can do, Saul. Nothing you can say, no offering you can make for forgiveness. God has determined this is what will occur. Then Saul said, finally he accepts it. I have sinned, yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me. He acknowledges that the kingdom has been taken from him, but he doesn't want to be publicly embarrassed. He says, I acknowledge what I have done. I know what the consequences are, but don't shame me now in front of the people. Return with me while I offer up the offerings, and don't publicly shame me by the people, okay? That I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel returned after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. When the sacrifice was over, Then said Samuel, bring hither to me Agag, king of the Amalekites. So Agag, the captive Amalekite king, is brought out. And Agag came to him in chains, and Agag said to himself, surely the bitterness of death is at hand. Agag sensed what was about to happen. He realized, maybe he felt that Saul would spare him. It was a custom, by the way, in ancient times that kings spared kings. I don't know. But when Samuel is on the scene, Agag realizes, it's over. Nothing is going to help me. Samuel said to him, as your sword has made other women childless, so may your mother be made childless among the women. And Samuel hewed, cut in pieces, hacked to death Agag before the Lord in Gilgal. And then finally, Samuel returned to his home in Ramah. Saul went up to his house in Gibeath Shaul, and Samuel never again went to see Saul until the day of his death. Okay, Samuel never attempts to engage Saul again. Okay. Now, that's the episode. Okay. Do you think God was being too harsh? Do you think the punishment is correct? Anybody? Anybody have any thoughts about it? You now know all the facts. Okay, Gail and then Michael.
Well, it occurs to me that Saul was the first king of Israel. So he very much had to set a precedent,
Yeah.
and he was, in the end, not quite worthy.
Being the first king representing God as the ruler of the Jewish people, Saul's actions take on very deep significance. It is not only that he is king, not only that he is God's agent, regent among the people of Israel, but he is setting the pattern for all future kings of Israel. So like people at pivotal moments, he must be totally, Gail is saying, beyond reproach. He must set a very high example. Michael?
Well, so I was thinking of this more, well, kind of like God pointing out, you're king because you were anointed through me. You didn't listen to me. Now I'm taking that away. Saul still gets to go on and be, nothing horrible has happened to him really, other than him not being anointed. The rest of his downfall is because of his own personality later on. But
Right. So what does it mean then, Michael, when it says, what does Samuel mean when he speaks about God in God's name? And Samuel says, God is taking the kingship away to you and he's giving it to another. What is Saul being told?
well, he's told you won't be able to pass this on to Jonathan. This is where it ends, and there'll be a new king that comes in and gets that privilege.
You will not hold on to the kingship and it will not descend to your house. So as far as God is concerned, the kingship will not continue through you. But as Michael says, Saul doesn't stop being king right away. Okay. What is the punishment? What is the punishment that God is inflicting upon Saul right away that Saul is now going to have to deal with? We'll see that next chapter. Samuel will immediately go and anoint a new king of Israel. And Saul will very quickly come to realize that David, this young man who arose from nowhere, who suddenly becomes absolutely popular with the people, he's kind of like the Achilles of the Jewish people. If Achilles was the hero of the Trojan War, David, from the time he arises, from the time he fights Goliath, people say, this is the man. They even had a saying in Saul's day while he was still king: Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. Okay? Saul, even before he loses the kingdom, sees the rival and knows what is going to happen. He is made to watch as David slowly assumes power. David will marry into the royal household. Saul will try and kill him. His children, his daughter and his son, will side with David and will help David escape their father. Saul will watch with growing paranoia as David becomes more and more popular and people turn to David. So you are right, Michael, he didn't lose it right away, but he is treated to that special hell of a king to watch power slowly slipping away from him. And he knows that even before he actually will die in battle, and he will die fighting the Philistines, that his kingdom will essentially slip away from him. So he will watch his arch rival, his arch enemy, David, take on the kingship of Israel. Okay. Now, this is powerful stuff, okay? And you might think, some people think, well, God was too harsh with Saul. After all, what was Saul's offense? He listened to his army. He was a little soft-hearted. He spared the Agagite king. But that's not what Saul's problem was. Remember, a Jewish king is not an independent source of authority. He was supposed to keep a copy of the Torah. He was supposed to be the example of God's law. If a king starts making his own rules, if a king starts doing what he wants and isn't doing what God wants, he becomes a positive danger, because the king suddenly is seen as an authority in his own right. Saul's real sin was when he no longer represents God, when he no longer is an agent for God, when he becomes his own source of power. And God must thoroughly and completely reject Saul as being king, and Saul will go through it. By the way, right after this, in the next chapter or two, you will see that Saul is inflicted with what is called an evil spirit, okay? I don't mean like he has to be exorcised. He goes through a period of melancholy. In other words, he sees what's happening. He becomes suspicious. He becomes paranoid. He can't enjoy anything anymore, despite the victories and whatnot. David's winning the victories. David's gaining the popularity. David is increasing in power. And Saul is becoming more and more jealous and more. He eats himself away. And you have this picture of Saul wandering in the palace at night, crazy with worry and with fear. It's kind of like they say that Richard Nixon, in the years of his impeachment, used to wander around the White House and speak to the White House photos of the presidents, used to talk to them. How can this be happening to me? Saul is driven mad. He's driven mad with the realization that he's lost power. So this is the end of Saul. In the notes, I will give you the notes for now, both. I didn't send the notes out to you. These will be combined notes. The Wars of Saul, or what I will call the Rise of Saul, his glorious period, and then I will trace his decline through the notes. You'll see what happens. Over a period of 20 years, Saul goes from being the first exemplar king of Israel, has a very good beginning, but tragically, because of some faults in his own character will cause Saul to lose everything he has gained. And sadly, he will see in his lifetime the end of his own dynasty. He will know, like Eli was told earlier, that his line will not continue, that it will not go well with it. Okay. Everybody good? All right. So next time we continue on with the story of the rise of King David. Without question, one of the most beloved characters in Jewish history. Moses is the most important. Moses is the closest to God. But David is without question a unique character. I will not say he is blameless. David sins too. And as you're going to see, David sins severely. He's not a blameless king. But David has three things that Saul does not have. He has this intense love of God, which places God at the heart of everything. Even when he is sinning and even when he falls, David never loses his love and commitment to God. Number two, David is a man who is a poetic soul, okay? He can sin, but even though his actions betray him, he is probably one of the greatest poets and religious philosophers of all of Judaism. He is, according to tradition, the composer of the book of Psalms. He's imbued with a deep love of God. And number three, what Saul could never do, David, when he sins, has this ability to be completely repentant. When David is acknowledged, when he is confronted with what he has done, he doesn't equivocate. He accepts the consequences at God's hand, and David is going to suffer. In some ways, David's life is going to be harder than Saul's. He will watch his entire family dissipated. But David is this great soul who despite his faults loves the Jewish people and loves God. And you'll see that as it's reflected in the next couple of weeks. Okay. All right, everybody. Neil, go ahead. Oh, just bye. Okay. Bye, everyone. Everyone be well. We'll see you next Monday and next Wednesday. And I will try and get out the notes before Friday, so you can read all the notes for our 2 lectures.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Gail.
I was struck by, and I don't know whether it was just a English translation, but several times, repeated 3, 4, or 5 times, when Saul says to Samuel, he says, "Your God."
Yes,
He doesn't say my or our.
yes. He is saying that not because he disassociates himself from God, but because Samuel was the prophet of God. So when he is saying the Lord, your God, it means the God who sent you to me, who commissioned you for. He is not excluding himself. It sounds like he's saying, God is your God, Samuel, not my God. What he means is the God who commissioned you and the God who has appointed you to deliver his word and to anoint me and to select me. Do what is good in the eyes of the Lord, your God, the God who sent you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, Ron.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Everybody feel good.
That was very good tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. How are you feeling, Gail?
Okay,
Yeah, are you getting over it?
finally.
Oh, thank God.
I had one more comment, but I had to make.
Yeah.
I can only say it just
Yeah.
just between the 2 of us.
Oh, well, yeah, hold on. Let me take us off recording first before you share anything. Hold on here.
Hmm.
Stop recording. Yes.